see what it looks like from there. That's pretty tiny. Okay.
Is this pretty tiny or is this okay? Will be consistently tiny. Take one.
Yeah.
Take two.
That's better already.
Great.
Your giggle. Looks like the
We
bone.
might have to
like
put
the-
one of those in.
Yeah, looks like the bones of a fish.
Right.
I'm redlining. Why am I redlining?
I don't know. This is all important stuff that has to
is.
happen for making.
Yep.
This
It
is exactly in time process of sound engineering.
It's a visual thing too,
Ah, right.
right?
Because you see the spikes.
Hi, this is John Tully. Welcome to another edition of In the Act, produced in the studios at Mead Public Library. We're having a turn of the tables. I'm the guest host today, and my guest is Erica Huntzinger, who's also an employee here at Mead Public Library with myself. Erica, this is your mothership, really, that you're letting me drive. Thank you so much. Do you want to summarize a little bit real quick of what, just to kind of go over again, because I think it helps to know what this show is about. This is your baby, really.
Yeah, this came to me about, I don't know, probably 15 years ago or so, where I wanted to interview other artists. I wanted to, kind of get into the crux of what their process is, where their studio is, or their making space, and talk with them about, what drives them, what's the core, what are they thinking about, what influenced them, what inspires them. To kind of demystify what art is, what creativity is. And I have a master's degree in art therapy. And I think one of the things going into that field, what I was really wanting to do is, instead of going into getting a master's of like painting, because I'm a painter, I wanted to really demystify what creativity is for everybody, so that and what I learned, I went to the Art Institute of Chicago, had amazing instructors, and we really talked, and my student body was amazing, and we really talked about that the act of making is a healthy thing, and that everybody has their own version and ways of making, whether you're in the fine arts, which is where most people think that this creativity resides only, right? With painters and sculptors and architects and, I don't know, what am I missing?
Cooks, everything.
But in the fine art realm,
Sorry,
right?
I was in the kitchen already.
No, I know, but that's it.
Yeah.
But expanding that into the kitchen, and expanding that into the gardening area,
right.
And into those sort of like from scratch making, and then expanding even further, I think, to what you just said, construction.
Yeah.
That the people that have a craft that they're using to produce something that's not of themselves or of themselves, that it's this, that the act of making, whatever it looks like, wherever you're doing it, everybody does it. And that it's important to highlight and to talk about and learn about. And I think one of the crucial things about creativity and making is that it also has its form in meditative practice. Like you were talking, like if you're working at the factory, I worked at a factory for a year, and doing repetitive parts, it was meditative. It was very hard, but if you were on a press by yourself, there was this meditative practice to it, almost like crocheting, doing that, or having knitting, having that repetitive thing that you're doing. Bricklaying could be the same sort of thing, getting into those practices. Yoga, what does it look like? And all of those different experiences of action are important. So, and we make choices and aesthetic decisions every day, whether it's how you plate your food, to how you dress, how you apply your makeup, or how you walk out your door. It could be movement and performance. So,
And all of these things that you mentioned, and you could just go on and on and on, they all involve an extension of ourselves, right? I mean, a bricklayer, an efficiency in movement and an efficiency in a familiarity with the tools that are an extension of ourselves.
sure.
Just to watch a chef with their knife, or watch,
Oh, yeah.
just the fluidity that comes with this repetition. You talk about being a factory worker, right? And I think I love the concept of this show because it addresses all that of when you break it down, that arts are everywhere and that it's all connected. And I think it also helps humble us all to realize that we are all creative beings.
Absolutely.
Right? So thanks for creating this platform, and I'm really excited to see and to hear all these things. So it's really exciting to be part of this process, especially knowing that you've been thinking about it as long as you have. So,
Right.
yeah.
And I try and read books on it. I'm not the most eloquent speaker. As my friends know, I have interpreters all over the world to help me express myself as well. But the evolution of and the dynamism, particularly, I would say, during this year, where we had, the world shut down last March. We have been within this epidemic, this pandemic, for over a year now, and we were forced to change and forced to do things that we were uncomfortable with, and be, in some ways, be comfortable with the uncomfortable, and address things that we normally wouldn't. And within that, there's exploration, experimentation, and a form of, which I think is like a form of play in a way, so that you're trying to get at something through this dynamic engagement. And I think it's been inspiring to see. I'm going to cry in a second, but it's been inspiring to see like how many people, what they've had to do to create change for themselves. And that's a creative life. And, we talked before about when I interviewed you about going down and having that connection to the lake, and having to be a part of, you're going to the exact same place pretty much at the same time because it's dictated by your work. So either in the morning or after work, but it's never the same. It's constantly evolving and constantly dynamic. And yet the pattern of the day is the same, right? It is this sequence of 24 hours. It is the ebb and flow of the waves that doesn't change. Like there are things that are patterned that we can rely on that create structure for us. But then we have the experience of it and the feeling states of these beautiful creative moments that nature does and has. And I think that that's all within us as well. And that's that balance between that structure or pattern that kind of grounds us, as well as having the freedom to create within that. Yeah. I had this dream. I had this dream last year that I was walking through like this school, and there was a ton of doorways, and one of the doorways, like there was a table pushed up in the transom area of the doorway, and there was a sign, and it said, "No radial sand." And I was like, all right, that must be some environmental thing. Like, that's what I'm thinking in my dream. I was like, that must be some environmental thing. I've never heard of radial sand before. And what popped into my head in my dream was that like kinetic sand that's like mushy and movable, and you can build something up and just tap it and it'll fall back down again. It's very strange. And so I kept reflecting on it, because you're the master of your own dreams. I think that they're, of course, universal Jungian symbols and things that we all relate to, but I also believe that your own symbols are your own, and you have to kind of figure out what those mean, right? So I did a little bit of exploration on what radials are. And I was like, okay, wheel, and sand. I know what sand is. Been around it. What does that mean for me when you put those things together? And for me, it felt like, if it's radial sand, if it's this like idea that popped in my head, which was the kinetic sand, it's not stable. That's not, it's too loose. You can build it up, but it's easily broken down. It's easily taken away. And the radial is like the sun or, like a wheel, and has this particular structure. And so in some ways it's like, it's perfect for me. I need the radial and the sand. So no radial sand is actually kind of this funny metaphor, but it's opposite. I like radial sand is good. I need the wheel of stability and structure, and then the creative flow to go in it, which is just how I understand life and things. So
there's so much in that. Oh my God. I mean, and what's great is, just to shut up and have you actually come around to the same points that were in my head.
Sure.
The first thing I thought of was a radial sander, which is a disc.
Oh gosh, yeah, I didn't even think about that.
Well, that's the first thing I thought of. And then for you to come up to the sun and to circles.
Yep.
And the idea of grit as something that breaks things down and smooths them, right?
Right.
And we were talking about cycles in that last, and
Right.
So it was just so funny to like not interrupt, which is of course most of our tendencies is to go, oh, blah, blah, blah,
Yeah.
to kind of have you come around to that place. So, so speaking of cycles, and what I love about some of the things you touched on with the challenges that, and especially you think of musicians or people that are dancers, people at theater that are reliant on engagement. And we even talked about this, of just having this conversation to face, where your art form is reliant. I mean, we're fortunate to be visual artists that we're used to being in solitude in our studios, right?
Well,
to some extent.
Fortunate is a funny.
It is.
That might be your.
Okay. Yep. But when I think about how the musicians have, there's been this kind of like, I don't want to say this, we're all in this same planet, right? And we're all being affected by this thing. It's shutting us down. The dolphins are swimming in the canals in Venice, and you can see the mountains again, and other areas of the world. There's amazing things happening.
Yeah.
Just by being shut down.
Yeah.
But we are having to then reinvent. All of a sudden, theaters are happening on Zoom.
Yep.
And musicians are live streaming.
Right.
Which kind of comes back to that core of redefining what is in the act.
Right.
And so I guess thinking of the circle, I want to bring it back to what are we're all kind of coming back to our roots.
Sure.
What do your roots look like in terms of how did you end up in at the Art Institute, and what is it that triggered you? I'm assuming as a youth that brought you into the act of creation, of what I consider to be very youthful artwork. To see your work now, to me, one of the things I love about it is how you've broken out of constraints of anybody's or anybody dictating what it is. I see your work now, and I know it's yours in a way.
Oh, nice, thanks.
Because there's a feel to it. I mean, it's not like there's a feel to what you do that is coming from a place of joyful creation to me that reminds me of a happy childhood. Again.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, and because
those are great assumptions.
Yeah. Right. Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, so you.
But that's great. I mean, that's what I love about abstraction.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's one thing I love about abstraction is that you get to bring your own. Once I'm done with it, it doesn't really. Honestly, it doesn't matter what I brought into it, right? It's now your experience, and you get to travel with it in ways that are meaningful to you that might not be meaningful to me or are very meaningful to me. And I love that. If we're talking about, there's a few different questions in there that I want to get at, but in terms of like the act of creating, I don't exactly like the act of creating. It doesn't come from a place where I'm like, ooh, this is joyful. it doesn't come from that place. I feel like I actually have to do it. It's a need that I have to do that doesn't get expressed in other ways. It's the fluidity of the paint and the frustration of the paint that allows me to get at things inside that I wouldn't normally be able to do. I think my normal state of being tends to be a little up and happy and sunshiny, and I like people and I like being out. But I have these, as everyone does, have difficulties and issues and past things that you have to look at and reflect. You don't have to, but I think I do. And through painting, somehow those all of me seems to get translated easier and more fluidly through paint. So there's only one other person I know of, Byron Jin. He's a dear friend of mine, who's a painter. He doesn't really like the act of painting either. But that's another thing. So, but in terms of like being inspired, like initially, like where was I coming from? I don't remember not ever digging or making or, drawing. I was a coloring book girl for sure. Like my mom was a sculptor and did some drawings, colored pencils and charcoal and other sculpting tools. And my dad was a singer, but he was also a minister. My mom's a psychologist. And so I came from these helping fields, and both very creative as well, and expansive thinkers and deep, big hearts. And I mean, in the summertime, I was always carrying around a plastic red shovel and digging up things and sorting through them and observing nature and loving to be by water, and had my coloring books. And my mom always wanted to give me blank pieces of paper. And for me, it was too open, and it didn't have enough structure. And so I went through coloring book after coloring book, filling in colors that should be and filling in colors that shouldn't be, and really exploring color and intensity of color, usually with crayons. Like that was just my thing. And then I did, I think I got a book on rugs, like Eastern rugs or something. And I had a little canister of markers, and I would just fill in these tiny little things. And I think that was part of it. The other part that was influential was when I went to church, I would just look at the stained glass windows in the church all the time. And so the light just pouring through that glass, these like pale yellow and pale green with this like deep red and like almost violet blue. I mean, those colors, I can just feel them. It was just amazing. So I think all of those things kind of talk to each other. And so that's what I remember most about the visual stimulation, I think, from my childhood.
It's interesting because I almost see like this life gradient of when you talk about the urgency of the need to create, even as it almost sounds like the process itself is a, there's a part of it that's an escape from your childhood, right? I mean, in a way, literally, because I don't want to have to think. I just want to color. Mm-hmm. So give me the lines and let me do the work.
Yeah.
And then, and to find that happy place to the point where now that's an automatic thing. And now in a way, it sounds like what you're doing is you're maybe unloading, you're kind of digging through your closet and digging through some of the uncomfortable stuff within that process, which makes it not really fun to do, but then at least you're getting it out of you, right?
Right. And I love the product. I'm like, ooh, this is so pretty. Who did that? Like it doesn't feel of me in some ways. But yeah, it's definitely interesting. I mean, I call them internal landscapes. That's really what they are. They're improvisational pieces, all of them.
Welcome back. This is In the Act, program of Mead Community Radio. Erica Huntzinger is the guest of a show that is her creation, and will be many more shows to come. Really looking forward to these. And this is John Tully, turning the tables, and and we're discussing the art of creation as it applies to our lives and inspirations.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you were just speaking about both creating, the idea of applying color as a child to a given space. I could really relate to that part of, and that's kind of what I was getting at when you were interviewing me, is that being faced with that blank page and the expectations that come with that of making a thing, right? And the freedom that came with me to just to tap into my own daughter's experience and just fill it and not worry about what the thing is. And I think that's something I resonate now with when I see your work, and I got to know your work and to get to know you as well. But it's interesting. I think as you're describing the coloring book and the crayons, is one of the things I find is, first of all, you fill your space with layers in a way that is really loose, really freeing, as something I'm familiar with a theatrical background. It's almost like the afterthought, or it's the overspray. Sometimes is how it feels to me. It's like it's accidental. It almost feels accidental in some ways, which I really love.
Yeah.
And then it seems like, and I don't know if this is actually a part of your process, but it seems like the line almost comes afterwards, that there's a rhythm that comes afterwards, and there's
Interesting.
shapes kind of come afterwards, that they're almost, I don't want to say an afterthought, but it's almost the reverse of a coloring book in a way.
Sure.
That you're filling and then, so I don't know where I'm going with that, but I just found that interesting, the way you laid that out of how, that part of not wanting to really think about what you're doing.
Yeah.
Does
I
that relate
can't
at all?
even I think I got frustrated early on with, the hierarchy of, like, if you can make something look like something, then you're a great artist. And done. You get an A+. Like, I was so not interested in that, and I found it so frustrating that was the gauge that everyone was using, that I kind of rebelled, and I was like, all right, fine, I'm not going to draw at all. And kind of backed away from that. And everybody has their own, like, stubbornness or whatever they bring to their life that but I think that my paintings not only are just like these internal landscapes, and I want to get back to the line and stuff, but that they bounce between this sort of like abstracted realism and complete abstraction, non-objective. And I think maybe that's where we're talking about, is that, like, oscillation, I guess, between, that purely abstracted versus the line and having some structure, which goes back to the radial sand, right? Like that whole thing. And I think particularly this year in my studio, when we were talking about your process and stuff of your having this opacity, like you were painting really opaque and having these, I was painting very opaque as well. And I think also you can look at my work and be like, oh, that was done in spring. That looks like, Easter threw up on it. Or like, this is definitely a summer painting. There are these lushness, sunny things. And that one's in autumn. But it's also not only affected by the seasons, but affected by, what's happening in my life. And because this year was just so disruptive on so many levels.
Yeah.
In so many areas, in every fiber of our beings, it was disruptive. And it shows in my work. And I was making, I think, more opaque purely abstracted pieces last spring. And then they sort of morphed in the summertime to almost close to these abstracted realisms. For me, I mean, they're definitely not, but they have like, oh, like those could look, that looks more like a landscape, an actual landscape. Looks like there's stairs, or those might be flowers. They could be interpreted much more readily to associations of what's reality. And then they kind of bounced into these really transparent pieces dealing with light and darkness and depth. And I think those are, in some ways, I feel like I don't really know who or what's going to happen next with my work, because we're in this flux of life, and nothing is going to go back to the same, right? It's not a circle; it's more elliptical, or not elliptical, like spiral, right? Like you're coming back to some things, but they're changed now. And what do they look like? And the space between the last spiral you were at is very different. And I don't really know what my paintings are going to look like. I feel like I don't have control over composition or palette. I can only have the structure in which I'm painting on be the actual stability. And then whatever comes from it, wherever I'm at in my life, that's what kind of comes out. And to not know what they're going to look like, at least a little bit, has a lot of anxiety for me moving forward. So thinking about what you said, like there's this pieces of it are accidental, which I can almost like put hand in hand with play, are really important. I think I balk against rigidity a lot of times anyway, but the lines help with the structure as well. I usually write into my pieces because I'm so verbose that, and I really love cursive. I love how it dances. And so, but usually not readable, because I don't want the words to define the piece, because I want the viewer to have multiple definitions for themselves for the pieces. But anyway, I don't know if I answered.
I don't even know what I asked. So
well, we talked about like line and accidentalness. And
well, I'm really intrigued. I'm intrigued by this idea of kind of like dreading going into the studio, and I'm intrigued by the sense of light. My father had glaucoma his whole life, and on his final, as I drove him to the hospice, he was somebody that was diagnosed early on and was told in his 20s that he would become blind a lot sooner than he ended up seeing the rest of his life. I have no idea how well, but when you talk about a sense of lightness, and on the ride to the hospice, he was commenting on the hills of, isn't it beautiful and isn't it lovely?
Wow.
And sometimes I assume that what he's seeing is this sort of soft landscape that reminds me of the feeling I get with some of your paintings, or that sense of light.
Yeah.
And I think there's something, again, it's the eye of the beholder, and there's something so amazing about showing artwork to somebody. Actually, and during that time, the paintings I have, I was processing this loss, and celebrating too, the life,
Sure.
but they're very deeply personal, even though they're abstracts. There's this, and so to then present that, is there a process of, and you mentioned the play. I'm sorry, I'm all over the place because there's just a lot here.
Well, that's the thing, is like, this is fun because this is meandering talk, right?
Yeah,
it's not
right.
structured in the way. And that's, I think, where it can be confusing and might not feel linear in the same sort of way, but that's where a lot of creative talking can happen.
Right.
So I'm okay with this bowl of soup.
Yeah, good. So, I mean, it almost sounds like in the process of coming in, having to, I got to create, there's an extension of the tools and the materials that we talked about earlier that's happening through who you are and your experience this far, that leads you through the work sometimes into a sense of play, and is somewhat a kind of a relief to that burden you've been carrying, right? Do you leave the studio lighter Or
It
is
depends. You know, this is honestly this year in my studio, and I have a studio mate, Sarah Willardson. She's wonderful. It's the first year that I've actually enjoyed being in the studio occasionally. It's always been like, gotta go make the donuts or something, like this thing that I have to do. Like, you know, when you don't want to take a shower and you're like tired and you're like, I need some coffee, and you're grumpy. It's like, it has that sort of feel to it. Or I have to go exercise because I have to be healthy for some reason, or, you know, this sort of feeling states that you get. So that's always been what it is for me. And I think it's because the process is so challenging. I used to feel as if I would turn my insides out and paint with them and then have to reintegrate that. And that, just thinking about what that looks like, what that would look like or feel like, I think gives a different impression of what or how I create. So I've had to get comfortable with that uncomfortability. But it also there were also a lot of people in my life who were like, you have to go into the studio every day and you have to do your craft every day. And I was like, I can't live I can't be an okay person and go and paint every day. Like, that isn't possible for how I've created, how I use my own art, how I use my paint, how I make, how I create. I can't do that every day. It's too tough. It's too tough on me. And so I supplement with other things. I use my camera a lot. I've always taken tons and tons of photos and document, and I always have a sketchbook. I had a sketchbook on me all the time from high school on. I have just hundreds of sketchbooks, and I try and document those things, or take notes of myself and get something out every day. So I don't think it has to necessarily be like I don't have to paint every day to create. I just need to be in a flow of some sort that tunes into myself. But this year, I think particularly because we've had to adjust and shift so much, I made it a point to go into my studio and edit some things, rearrange, organize, and try and find some simpler systems that felt good for me to be there. So I set up a nice desk for myself, put a collage next to it. I do a ton of collage as well. And I started reading there, and that really helped to kind of get to know the place a little bit differently and to imbue a different states into it as well.
How long have you had a separate studio from your living situation? Has that been?
It's varied over the years. Yeah. I mean, one of my favorite studios was when I was living in Chicago, and we had a studio on Byron Street, or Byron and Ravenswood. So it was right by the train tracks, and we had these huge windows. It was on the first floor, and people would get off the train after they worked and walk by the window, and so you had this sense of energy going through. And I love being in the city. I love city energy so much. Right. And my studio mate at the time was Lois Keller, and which is funny because Lois from theater.
I just got all happy.
From so weird.
Yeah.
So strange from Milwaukee and her theater days, and you worked with her in theater, and she's been a huge source of inspiration and creative connection for me as a friend and as an active maker. And also our friend Rachel Weaver Rivera. And we've actually this year have done this like Marco Polo exchange. It's like this app that we use on our phone, and we send each other video messages and talk about our process and get to show each other our sketchbooks and our paintings. And I talk about our lives and what's shifted and what's shifting, or how we want to organize it and reorganize it. But that's this, even just that is an act of this creative act that we're collectively contributing to. So, where's your studio? I mean, so I've had, that was my favorite like studio, but sometimes my studio was in my lap.
Yeah.
Or I didn't have enough money to have a studio. And so I worked out of a barn or somebody's, I think I rented a barn to do a really large piece for a solo show at the University of Wisconsin called Our Seas, which is 8 feet by 26 feet. And I had my carpenter, I do have a carpenter because I'm not a great craftsperson, built for me before I had the space to actually, I'm like, this is funny. I had him build like, 13 8 by 2 wooden panels, but then I didn't have a place to actually paint them. So, where do you design things? How do you design things? How do you trust like that you're going to find something? That's all about like creative risk taking and challenging yourself, and kind of what we all do.
And it sounds almost like breaking down barriers, what you've just been describing in a way by not only one of the things I loved is just this idea that it is all connected in terms of like the photography, the sketchbooks. I've been keep meaning to try and get into sketching again. I've been feeling the call to like, get the pencil work.
Oh yeah.
To refine the line, which is funny that I got that simple, but
oh sure.
So, but this idea of kind of sounds like you're almost bringing a bit of that home element outside of the studio into the studio by reading there, by bringing in some comforts. It just sounds that way. I don't know if that's exactly what's happening, but
for sure,
of breaking down some of these boundaries that we put ourselves in with the pandemic. I took down all my window shades, but I like light. I don't like visual distractions. I have wide peripheral. I see things. And so I'm aware of energy. So I've been carrying these glass blocks around for 25 years or more. And the gal that moved out here with me was like, why'd you get rid of those? And no. And so I found a use for them finally, and I've stacked my windows. So I have light, but it's a visual barrier, but it's not blocking light.
Right.
But that was I've never had I've worked in studios outside of my home in theater, but I've always just been kind of a home studio guy. But
well, the other thing for me is that because I like to paint in oil.
That's
not
right.
that I like to. I don't really like oil.
Right.
We're not friends. My personality is completely acrylic. It dries fast. I'm fast. Easy to do. Washes with water. Oil paint. You can walk somewhere 2 feet and you're taking oil paint with you somehow on your hip that goes to your car, goes in your home.
Yep.
But the other piece is that it's, the fumes, I have fume sensitivity, chemical sensitivity.
Me too,
and so I can't actually have studio in my home if I want to paint in oil. And I like the separation personally.
Yeah.
I like the act of like, I have to go to my studio now. And
yeah. Well, and in some sense, I mean, when you talk about like, I don't know if you use the word dreading, but
Sure.
I mean, to eliminate that might release attention. I mean, it might be exactly what's kind of fueling you is that very dread,
Sure.
So to like,
oh, there's a point to anxiety.
right? Yeah. It's like, you got to do it.
In some ways. Well, yeah. Sorry, I interrupted that one.
No, it's okay.
Well, it's that balance of, I had to, you have all these evolutions in your own life and reflections and stuff. And there was this really telling point for me, where actually Lois and Rachel were videotaping, this was a while ago, each other talking about the creative process and having this conversation. And I was not there. And then they were having it in our studio. And then I came into the studio and was like, blah, 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 and like talked about everything and completely interrupted their moment. And we just kept talking and it kept filming. And they sent me the film of it. And I was like, oh, what did I do? Who am I? How are you guys friends with me? And, feeling really apologetic about who I was and how I relate in the world and what I do to the world. What does my presence do to the world, and how does it affect it? And their response was like, don't apologize. This is who you are, and we love you for that. And of course there was an interruption, and we can get back to that too. But this ebb and flow of like relationships is so important. But in that moment, not in that moment, but over time thinking about that, I've had to process that what I consider my weaknesses may also be my strengths, and what I think my strengths are can also be my weakness, and to really try and level up with some of those pieces within myself, I think helps me navigate my paintings as well within that. Like, I have this dread or I have this anxiety. That's considered negative, right? But what does the anxiety or what does the dread do to inform what my product or my piece is or my process? So thinking about those things as, how can you see it from the opposite way? And I'm not trying to do it in a artificial or formulaic way. It's just something that naturally I try and check in on.
Welcome back. You're listening to In the Act here on Mead Community Radio, broadcasting from Mead Public Library, recording in Mead Public Library, Sheboygan, Wisconsin. I'm John Tully. I'm a guest host, and I'm talking with the founder and permanent host, I don't know, my dear friend Erica Huntzinger, who's a creative artist and an assistant librarian along with myself here at Mead. We've both been here the same amount of time. Really amazing.
We had the same start date.
Yeah, same hire. We went through the same process.
Right, same time.
Very grateful to be here at Mead
Absolutely.
Public Library.
Oh my gosh.
So amazing. I've really been enjoying this conversation. So thank you.
Me too.
Where you left us off, I really was feeling like the dark, we talking about the darkness. It's a balance, right? It's a balancing act. And this can be true compositionally too. It can be
Absolutely.
such a challenge to find that balance. And often it's the very thing that we struggle, at least for me as a visual artist, what bugs, it's almost like I'm trying to fix things. I'm
Sure.
I'm filling it, and then how do I make this pleasing to my eye?
Sure.
I don't always succeed.
No.
But it's something that we try, right? And that's part of the process. That's part of our process. Can you talk a little bit on balance,
Sure.
both within your internal balance as well as on the piece itself?
Yeah, sometimes I try not to clean it up. When I try and clean it up to make it look a little pretty, or to be like, oh, look at that, it's I feel like I'm tying a bow on it somehow, and it loses an essence. It loses its dynamism. Just such a hard word, anyway. And I want to hold those pieces alive. I want them to be shown and to be seen. I am pretty against, if you know me, positive psychology. I am not one who's going to try and twist things into what's going to be good. How do we make this better? Not how do we make this better, because I think that's different. But ignoring or trying to avoid or patching or covering over the darkness or the hard and the challenge. And I want to know how you got there. And you're not a full person if you're not admitting, well, you are. I'm getting a little on a soapbox here, but I feel, I guess, that I'm not a full person if I don't address all of my feelings, my sadness, my grief, my anger, my happiness, my joys, the laughters, the contentments, the disappointments, and that's what makes me whole. And I try and be an advocate to other people for that as well. And so it's important for me in my pieces that they have those in there as well, that they live in this landscape that is of that. That's what my hope is. Yeah.
Is that something that, I suppose it's going to depend on the moment. It's going to depend on the mood and the piece. I'm curious because I haven't seen you in process, but I've seen some of your work. And
Sure.
I mean, obviously you can express that in a color. You can express that in how you apply that. Yeah. Right? Big time.
Yeah.
You can express that in rhythm, with line.
Right.
You'd mentioned this kind of idea of loose cursive, and it made me think of those snapshots I'm getting.
For
Remind me
sure.
of that same thing.
Of that same thing.
You know, it's
and it's musical to me too.
Yeah.
Like a lot of times they're lyrics because I'm listening to musics that I tend to veer towards. What are those ballads? Like I like
murder ballads.
Murder ballads, not necessarily, although I do like Tom Waits.
Uh-huh.
But these, belting out ballads of song that I can sing to that speak to me, and those kind of get embedded in there, or there's a thought or a saying, and that's the cursive.
Is there things that you're trying to work out through the process of a painting, or are there things that come up within that process?
I think it may be hand in hand, but I have a friend down in Chicago, Mike Miller, who owns Delilah's Bar. Great guy. And he has probably one of the other biggest collections of my paintings besides my parents. And he, I think, what did he said something like the last installation of work that he saw, he said something about like, Huntzinger, he doesn't call me Erica. He just calls me Huntzinger. And he said, Huntzinger, I think I like your paintings a lot better when you're depressed. And I'm like, well, it's interesting because there is the colors imbued differently. The lines I use are different. I think I started out in fine arts with ceramics, and so that act of like cutting through something or using a fork to scrape into, like I use like carpentry tools and stuff into my paintings. I paint on wood for that very reason, so that I can get that grit, like the sandpaper you were talking about earlier, that informs the painting, but it's my life that informs the work. And so it's that internal landscape, right? It's that depending on how I am, what my relationships look like, what the world around us looks like or feels like, and that all gets translated.
This probably isn't I'd be curious to know is he seeing when he's thinking of you as depressed, is the counterbalance coming out through the work that it's brighter and happier?
No.
In his view, no. He's responding
Yeah.
to the darkness that's contained therein.
I think that it has
you are
like,
literally expressing that darkness within your painting.
Sure. Yeah, I think so. I think they tended to have more scrapes and anger. Like they're just a lot heavier handed, I think, in some ways.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. Yeah. It's really interesting. That's why I love seeing what happens. I like the reflection of it. This is a very sweet story, but I also do watercolors, and I had a whole series of watercolors that I had done over the years, and I didn't like any of them. I tried multiple ways to draw on them and paint over them, and not paint over the whole thing, but like add different elements to it, because watercolor is really weird. And once you get to the point of, there's sort of like a no return, like you can't do anything to it. And I would maybe sew into one, and it wouldn't work, or so I have just like this whole stack of watercolors. And this was a few years ago now. And I'm like, I am going to clean up my studio. And one of the things that I'm going to do to clean up my studio is to edit out all of these pieces that I don't like and aren't working. Haha, good for me. And I felt so proud of myself that I had like cleaned up something and I was taking care of something to throw it away. And on my way to the garbage can, literally like a foot away, my partner stealthily came up behind me and was like, "What are you doing?" Like, I'm throwing away these paintings. And I'm like, "They don't work." And he's like, "Well, if you're just throwing them away, give them to me. Let me see what I can do with them. Because if you're just going to throw them away anyway, like you can't." And I was like, I remember at the time feeling like, "Oh, sure, you go right ahead. There's no way you can make these good, but okay." I was like, okay, really haughty about it. If you know me, I have this awful thing about me that gets that way, Marty.
Yeah.
And so he took them and he uses gel pens and pencil and other things. And about 2 weeks later, he said, "Do you want to see what I've done?" And I was like, "Sure." Like there was no way in my mind that these could be salvaged or saved or changed in any way, that they were an absolute. And he pulled out, I don't know, maybe 10 or so, and they had been transformed. They were transformed. He had collaborated on them and they were beautiful. And it was the most remarkable transformation experience, I think, to allow someone else to contribute, who's also your partner, and then makes the work great. It's like it was just so lovely.
These were posted a couple months back, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and they are beautiful. So it's fun to hear what they were born from.
Yeah.
It's really wonderful to hear that.
And that's, those are all like these tells in our lives too. Like, and Cooper Deers is the guy, is my partner. And he's a wonderful artist in his own right. And but to have like somebody else in your life, no matter who it is, that helps you transform, that is remarkable. Right. And that's what I think is so important about talking about this creativity, that there's a spectrum of creating and that what do you draw from? Not literally draw with a pen and pencil, but what do you draw from and where can you draw from and how can you connect and collaborate with others to support that spectrum of creativity.
That's another boundary you're breaking down. You're about to put those in a trash receptacle, right? And to let them go.
Yeah.
It's amazing to hear that backstory because, I know your work only slightly better than Cooper's, really. So, but I thought that was such an interesting because as somebody that Cooper dealing in fluid line, very meticulous line compared to you filling space. And so often because he's dealing in linear things, there is a lot of negative space around them. So that for you two to, talk about balance. Right. And so to not only see how your work could balance each other, but to hear how, in some ways, even within your life, that created a sense of balance in this time. To think that's like one year into a pandemic,
right?
You're clearing house,
right? And
he's going to say, "Oh, well, what are you doing?"
Right.
Let me see those.
And then that it's not always that way, right? And that we all have these changing roles, and that we're not static, and that sometimes we're the radial sand, and sometimes we're the radial, and like how do you oscillate and find the ways in which are going to work for you at that time, and that you don't have to be defined by whatever it is.
Yeah. And the radial sand makes things smooth. It's funny that we're talking about grinding, creating smooth, this texture.
But that both are important.
Yeah.
Like it's all important.
Yeah.
What did you say last on your show? You said, it's all the same. Like it's all the same. Like it's all important. Mine is it's all important.
Yeah, it is. It is. Wow. Balance. How do you feel going forward?
I'm so curious about that. I don't even know. I just set up a big show in at Uncommon Ground in Chicago. And I know the owners, Helen and Mike Cameron, and they asked me to put up a show. They'd reopened their restaurant, and that was a big deal. And it's, I think, their 30-year anniversary this year of having 2 restaurants in Chicago. And they asked me to keep it up through October. And I was just like, wow, what a gift to do that and then be connected, and that, people coming back into the restaurant get to sit and see my work then too. And I get to be a part of, in some ways, I get to be a part of that re-entry, right? That springtime of re-entry of extending our relationships further like we had been in the past, right? With friends and different spaces. But I have some work at Sheboygan Works with that Craig Grabhorn is helping out with, and I still have potentially a what is it called? A residency with him, or his work of water, land, and sky. And I still have a residency for printmaking down at Studio 224 in Port Washington that I haven't accessed or done anything with for a year because of the pandemic. And I hope to do more printmaking. I hope to keep trying to invigorate my studio practice with maybe more of a balance of like, maybe that feels more like home a little bit too, like adding those maybe nurturing elements that support studio time a little bit differently for me. I hope to, I'm not sure. I guess the most important thing to me right now is how we're going to live together and how and what it looks like. And the landscape is always changing, right? It's this, again, this radial sand that I come back to. And it'll be just like this interview in some ways, this sort of meandering of improvisationally trying to find my way and also having some stability and with friendships and work to guide those things. And I am eternally grateful for my friends across the country and in Sheboygan, and they're just great. And follow those doors of love. That's kind of always kind of my practice, I guess. So I guess I'll keep doing that.
It's interesting to hear that, and to sometimes it's important for us to pause and recognize that we've actually arrived somewhere. Even like within this conversation, right? It's been meandering, but we started at a point, and we got to a point, and maybe that's part of the radial part. That it's going to come back around again.
Right.
The train's going to come back around again. You can still get on. What are you waiting
Sometimes
for?
I fall off.
I'm
glad that somebody comes back to pick me up.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. You're out, you're heading for the garbage can, but somebody might come in and go, do you have your ticket? Let me see your ticket. I'm going to take this for you.
Right.
So,
right.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for this opportunity. And it's really exciting to
grateful.
think there's just so much possibility and inspiration that can come, from these conversations. So really thank you for kind of like breaking this egg open and getting this out.
This is awesome. I'm really excited to get digging. And thank you so much for leading the way for all of us too. It's just really awesome. Yeah. Thanks to Mead Public Library. Best. Oh my gosh. Everybody here. Fantastic.
Yep.
So Mead Community Radio.
Bing, bing, bing.
In the Act is produced in the studios at Mead Public Library in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. More information on the web at meadpl.org.